Sound and data.
So here we are with Dr. Paul Vickers, and we've just met through a mutual friend, David Worrell, who I interviewed a couple of months ago, and I always, and I'll do the same with you, ask for other pointers to people working in the area of sound and data and sound art and sonification, blah, blah, blah. So, Paul, why don't you give us a little intro to your point of view on all this?
Potter's history. Well, yeah, I'm a computer scientist by birth. My first degree was in computer science, and my PhD, though, was in auditory display and sonification, because I really had an interest in the use of sound. I grew up listening to Jean-Michel Jarre and liked electronic music and thought it would be cool to put the two together. So I went scrabbling around for a PhD supervisor and I had a really dumb idea for something to do with sort of an auditory display of paintings. I can't even quite remember what it was about, but he came up with something much more achievable, which was the sonification of running programs.
Yes.
So I did that for my PhD, and that kind of got me hooked, and I've been interested in it ever since. But the thing that's really interested me is the role of the aesthetic in sonification. The work I did for my PhD was self-described as musical program sonifications. My supervisor was Jim Alty. I don't know if you ever came across Jim.
No.
He's retired now, but he's a computer scientist, but he also composed.
Aha.
And he introduced me to Steve Reich and Philip Glass and people like that, and Frank Zappa. So he broadened my musical horizons. So he had this view that sonification could be musical, not just bleeps and blobs. So the work I did for my PhD was trying to represent the internal structures of a programming language using a hierarchical melodic organization. So I guess an earcon type approach, which earcons are hierarchical. So we had what I called leitmotifs or motifs, little short themes representing each element of the Pascal programming language. And these were hierarchically organized. So selections were all based on one theme and iterations based on another theme, and then we kind of developed that theme for each of the individual constructs.
So almost like icons. What do they call those? Well, sound icons anyway, that represented structure.
Yeah, I mean, there was auditory icons at the time, but they were more sound effects, weren't they?
Yeah.
Whereas the earcon was a structured musical phrase, and they're often organised hierarchically.
Right.
So we had this idea of variations on a theme. So an if statement would sound a bit like an if-else statement, but not quite the same, but very different from a while loop, which would sound similar to a repeat loop.
I see.
And, you know, the conceit was that if you did this and then played back your program, having slowed it down many thousands of times, of course, you could hear what your program was doing in real time. Well, sorry, not in real time, but in playback time. And
so
with
you get a gestalt of the form over the course of
yeah, and if you'd written the program and you had an idea of what it should be doing, you'd have an expectation of what it should be doing. So what you'd be listening for is where the sound deviates from the expected path. So the naive question I always got from people was, so the program will tell you where the bugs are? Well, no, because no software is able to self-diagnose, but what it does is just tell you what it's doing. So if you're expecting a loop to iterate 50 times and it exited after 5 iterations, then there's a clue there. That's where your bug possibly was.
Well, with your comment about programs self-diagnosing, my mind went immediately to Skynet.
Yeah.
You know, the Terminator thing. But anyway.
But I figured if we could have a program that could tell you where the bugs were. We wouldn't need to sonify it. We just get to tell you where the bug was.
We just need to stand back and watch out.
Go to line 53. That's where the problem is.
Yeah.
So that was all very musical, and it was done in such a way that because it was supposed to be musical, it would be okay to listen to, and it wouldn't be really horrible and frustrating. It was in its own way, because we used a general MIDI sound palette, because that was what was available. You know, we had a Sound Blaster card, and that was the state of technology in the mid-90s.
Been there a little bit with some of my other work,
Yeah, so it was all MIDI, and it was done by external sound modules, which was great. But that got me to thinking about this whole role of the aesthetic in sonification design, and this has been a fairly long process, because a long journey for me, I think, because as a computer scientist, I'm surrounded by other computer scientists. So these people with all this aesthetic knowledge and musical knowledge work in other departments and other universities, and never the twain shall meet, I think.
Well, we're working on it, but yeah.
Yeah, well, we are. That's why I've befriended people like David Worrell.
Yeah. It's exactly why I wrote that paper we were referring to before we started up, about, the relationship between sonification as defined by the ICAD community, or at least a part of it, and what I'd seen in practice, Well,
that's right. I mean, it's interesting, because Greg Kramer, way back at the start of ICAD, he was calling for people to work with composers and the like. Though there is still maybe I think what Alexandra Supper called it might have been a sort of composerly view of sonification, where if you can just get the composition right, it will all work. And of course, there's much more to it than that.
It depends on the intent, really. Do you intend to make a work of art, or do you tend to make a dual-purpose thing that is someone in a specific field of science could use that still has an aesthetic kind of quality?
Well, this is where the whole problem of the aesthetic comes in, because what are you using it for?
Right.
What you just suggested is a dual-purpose sonification, whereas I think I would argue that you're focusing on the aesthetic and maybe using some compositional techniques and tropes to make it good at its primary function, which is to communicate information, not to be an aesthetic experience. However, the aesthetic experience has to support the inference of the information from the data, from the sound. So I think what I've kind of got to is we need to design sonifications with experience in mind, at the heart of it, in fact, but not design sonifications as aesthetic pieces, because then we're doing art. Yeah.
Right.
And it's very interesting to me that no one accuses visualization designers of producing art.
Yeah, I just got this great article from my collaborator, Tim Purkis, that addressed just that, showing the data visualization handled by possibly a more talented graphic designer than other things, and where does the information from the visualization break down and just become like a pretty looking, swath of lines instead of a hairball like most things are. I mean, we're working with network data or net science type stuff lately, and the hairball problem for big data is a big deal, and there's a hope that there's some sort of sonification strategy that will help out with that.
Yeah, I mean the visualization community has all of its graph drawing aesthetics, which pretty much is layout rules, like don't have edges that cross and things like that.
Edge bundling and
Yeah, I had a PhD student recently who looked at graph layout. Her PhD was on different techniques for visually laying out graph data, network data. And she's avoided the giant hairballs. Maybe I'll point you to her work. use clustering to do it.
Yeah, okay. So,
Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
you continued your work then after the post MIDI, general MIDI instrument, kind of.
Yes. So in 2004, I presented a paper at ICAD on sonification aesthetics. It was very naive because I was just getting into it, but it got people thinking about it. That led to invitations to write a book chapter for the aesthetic computing volume, the MIT Press that Paul Fishwick edited.
Yeah, I work with Paul actually at UC.
Yeah. So, he contacted me and asked me to write this chapter on sonification aesthetics. So I did.
Yeah.
And then it is when I met Bennett Hogg at Newcastle University, because they invited me over to give a seminar there, because that's just across the road, because I'm in Newcastle in the north of England as well.
Oh, okay.
And I spoke to Bennett, and he teaches composition, and he does electroacoustic improvisational performances and that sort of thing.
Right.
That's what he likes, and he likes this whole idea of networked performance.
That's
interaction.
That's an area I have quite a bit of experience in. Actually.
Yeah. So I was talking to him about sonification, and could he help me with this aesthetic side? So we then wrote that paper, which was presented at ICAD 2006, which we introduced the aesthetic perspective space, which actually talks about what you talked about in your AI and Society paper.
Right.
Which was about when we listen to sonifications, we can hear them as different musical genres.
And I have to apologize for not having included that as a reference.
I know it's dreadful. I feel most hurt. But
well, I'll just have to. I don't know. Mea culpa. Anyway,
people come to the same conclusions independently, don't they?
Yeah. Well, for me, it was just like this definition that Thomas Herman had put up, which was so strictly rigid with the construction of whatever musical thing you were doing being absolutely reproducible every time with the same result, and all that kind of stuff. And it should be, but that also kind of pigeonholes you into this space,
Yeah, I don't take exception to sonification being reproducible, because if it's the same data set, then the information shouldn't change, so the representation of the information shouldn't change unless you change it by changing the parameters of the display. I think, like you, what's caught me a bit and what I couldn't quite reconcile myself to was viewing sonification purely as scientific.
Right, yeah.
Because a lot of research, if you do research through design, and you take the whole way of design thinking and you iterate around solutions, you don't do it scientifically. Product design and other types of design, you come up, you get your brief, you prototype a solution, you test it with people, and you iterate around until you get something that works. Now, there's no science there, but you still end up with good products. And I don't think sonification design has to be separated out of that, and there's no reason why you couldn't do sonification design in the same way. You do it in this iterative sort of research through design way. But even then, is information visualization science?
Obviously not, in my opinion.
I'm not sure it is. It's.
I think part of the deal too is that the accessibility to visualization has been there since the draft board, where someone could sit down with a sextant and a compass and start laying elements out. Whereas the tools really, and this is why Greg Kramer and Bruce Walker and those guys started talking about it in about '95 or so, because suddenly microcomputers availed people of the ability to think about this as an additional problem to solve.
Well, that's true, although I'll look it up while we're talking, but there's a really interesting example of sonification from the late 19th century, where someone had proposed using telephone wires to send data relating to the state of cows and cattle for medical diagnosis, veterinary diagnosis over the telephone by sonifying the data. So,
fantastic! I haven't heard about that one.
Really new. Someone's always thought of it being.
Oh yeah. Well, like me with my aesthetic thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, the bottom line with all this is, or not the bottom line, but something that interests me is when you got together with Bennett, then did the orchestration techniques change? I mean, did you start using pure, electroacoustic techniques and that kind of stuff?
No, because that wasn't the idea. The idea was, it was kind of a reverse engineering approach. It's what the aesthetic perspective space first proposed, where what we did was we looked at a whole bunch of sonifications and other auditory displays that had been produced, and then loosely paralleled them with a musical genre that they most resembled. Yeah, so you get these very tonally musical sonifications, such as the one I did for my PhD, and then you get the more I keep using the word abstract when I think musicians would use the word concrete, but these less tonal. So you'd have atonal, and then you'd have the sort of music concrete style electroacoustic sonification.
One thing I found myself doing is forcing what would be chromatic material through a quantizer that scales it to a Hungarian minor or something like that. Yeah, that's completely illegal, but in order for it to be accepted to less to open the range of taste, I guess, for the acceptability of stuff. So I've moved away from that, but I just thought I'd bring it up.
Yeah, the question we were raising with this was if you have a kind of sonification design where you're intending to use some sort of tonal musical framework, then let's map it over onto the musical domain and look at what ways that music in that genre or that domain is successfully written. Because composers and orchestrators are very, very good at writing the score in such a way that it communicates the idea they want to get across. Now, of course, the communication here isn't information, it's some sort of idea. And then there's a whole question about whether music can ever be representational that I'm not sure I want to get into today.
Yeah, well, this is a huge topic in general, but the one thing I'm sort of starting to really have as part of my core deal is that the separation of the visual and the auditory was purely technical. I mean, yes. Edison made the the tintype phonograph thing and the motion picture camera, and they're related electromechanical approaches, but they were in completely different spaces, and then you had to sync those together to get the talkies by the 20s. Mm-hmm. And we're just at the point now where maybe with modern gaming engines, it's a whole other kind of thing where you could think of it, and we've been referring to it as more multimodal representation.
Yeah, or transmodal is.
Yeah, transmodal also.
What Bennett would call it.
Okay.
So the idea was, if you've got this idea for sonification and you think it's going to be sort of, say, tonally musical, right, can we use the tropes and compositional black magic that David Worrell calls it, that would enable us to organize that sonic material in such a way that the aesthetic is stronger? The idea being, if it's got a really strong, coherent aesthetic, then it might be better at doing what it's supposed to do, which is communicate information. Now, no one ever really bought that as an idea. I don't think I'm still waiting for people to follow it up. Sometimes I feel like I'm just on my own in all this, shouting things at people that I had.
There's you and I at least.
But then you wrote that paper, so that's great. Yeah. There's two of us. The two of us that are wrong now.
Yeah. There's another thing that's come up. I'm working with neuroscientists on this larger project, and one little piece of information that went by was that the auditory cortex, while smaller than the visual cortex, is also more deeply linked. It's faster and more deeply linked to the amygdala and the inner brain, fear, emotion, passion, all that stuff. It goes right to that. whereas the visual cortex is kind of spread out all over everywhere, and all the other sort of cognitive processes, sort of get put into the mix, more analytic and stuff. They're very against left brain, right brain distinctions lately. But did you run into any of that kind of thing, or am I?
No, I've not really got into the neuroscience. I've been finding it stressful enough trying to get into the musical side of it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the whole taste thing is a big deal.
Well,
I mean, I was making
taste. Nowhere near taste. I studied music at high school, and my music teacher was very quick to point out taste is very different from it's not all a matter of taste as to whether it's good music or not.
Yeah. But have you used your approaches with Bennett with actual scientific context, or has it always been in the computer science? I mean, besides the computer science area that you were investigating, so.
No, the trick was to find people to work with. Being in a computer science department, there's generally just me that is interested in sonification in the department. So
right.
there isn't. I've never had a big team of people to work with. So I'm very opportunistic.
Right.
So we came up with that idea, and then more recently, I was thinking about the relationship with listening, and a few people have been thinking about listening the last few years.
Right.
You talked to Florian Grand recently.
Right, yeah.
Very
I don't know
into
if you've
listening.
listened to that, yeah.
And he's worked with Thomas Herman. And we have a point of disagreement, I think, between us, but we're still interested in the listening experience. So then Steve Barris and I wrote that chapter for the Sonification Handbook on sonification aesthetics, which put forward the idea that we should be thinking about sort of pragmatist aesthetics when it comes to sonification, which is to view, so that the aesthetic doesn't lie in the object itself, it's in the way we experience the object. And the challenge there is we can never design the experience. We can only ever design for experience. And this is what user experience design is all about now. And HCI is sort of no longer HCI now, is it? It's UX.
No. Yeah, right.
We're talking about user experience and how to design for good user experience. Now, the experience of sonification, it comes principally through listening. So the work I've been doing much more recently is thinking about the listening experience, and Bennett and David and I are just collaborating on a chapter that we're submitting at the moment on this very subject. And what it comes back to is what you mentioned, is this sort of multimodal or transmodal nature of listening, which we've kind of lost. And if you go back before movies and before radio and before TV, sound was part of everyday life, and music was part of everyday life, and music was something we experienced live.
Right.
When you experience music live, you don't just hear it, do you? You feel it.
And you see the expression on the face of the violist or whatever.
Yeah. So it's an audio visual haptic experience, because you watch the performance, you listen to the performance, you feel the performance. I think the musical gestures maybe trigger sort of embodied responses in the listener as well.
Right.
And then you get things like foot tapping and swaying and moving. So there's this very whole body experience involved in listening. And sonification, I think, has suffered maybe from this view that it's just sound.
Right, right. I mean, there's so many sonifications, and there's a breakdown in the PLOS article that I forget the author, and I'll forward it to you.
Dubus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where they go through and just sort of categorize everything.
That's right.
And there's a really amazing result of reading that for me was to realize that the approach has been to turn bar graphs into melodies, essentially, which is kind of such a limited, sort of auxiliary to visualization, as opposed to bringing some fundamental new approach, which sound obviously has. That's just a different type of experience.
Yeah, I actually wrote about that in 2005, and
yeah,
I said, a lot of auditory graphs, as they're called, are really just people trying to create an audio version of a graph or of a chart,
And I would
rather
say
than the data.
the vast majority of sonifications fall into that area. I mean,
Yeah, so to me that was a kind of a second order sonification. You've got the underlying data set or function, then we've got the visual representation of it, which might be a chart or a graph, and then we've got the sonification of that visual representation.
Yeah.
We've got this metaphor already in our minds of the graph or the bar chart, so we'll sonify that, rather than think, well, what can we actually get from the data?
Yeah.
What are the properties in that data that we're actually wanting to know, and is that the best way to do it?
Well, what was it, multi-representational, or I forget the word Bennett used. We were saying multimodal. Transmodal. Yeah. Sorry, I'm stuck on my own vocabulary here. But our thought, and I'm not sure we've been successful yet, but was to make sound, or the use of sound, fit as a corollary, but not completely linked in this way. Like the sounds that are being made are made because that's the sounds that this thing, whatever this, abstract computer constructed data object would make these sounds and would look like that, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because we're talking about that actually recently, Bennett and I, about how a sonification kind of needs to be in some way, the representation needs to be linked to the data.
Yeah.
And what we've had up till now is a great separation. I think partly because we've been using general MIDI tone generators. So there's not, because it was, at the time, it was the only affordable way to do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, David Worrell's a big proponent of Python and C sound.
He is, yeah.
And I've actually been in that area now. Well, recently we're using PD, but the synthesis itself is generally samples or synthesizers or calls to general MIDI.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's why I was asking you about the technique. I was curious if you were using ever using direct audification of the waveforms of a time series set of data and that kind of thing.
Well, interesting. I've just been working with a PhD student here who's not one of my students, but she was someone directed it to me.
Yeah.
She's working in the arts department, and she's into visualization and visual representations, and she's working with sort of microbial data.
Uh-huh.
And she's been working with some people down at Durham University using atomic force microscopes, and she's trying to reveal this hidden world that we can't see. So she's very interested in that.
Uh-huh.
And she came to me saying, can we use sonification to get at what these sort of microbial life forms are doing? And she showed me a graphs, which were basically time series plots of the atomic force microscope. Now, I didn't know anything about atomic force microscopes up until this point, but it seems you have a probe that wobbles up and down according to whatever's going on in the sample beneath it. And there's a bit of built-in noise that you have to factor out. But essentially, you've got these perturbations of the sensor head, and then this gets converted into data. So she showed me these, and I said, well, it's a nice graph. And I tried two ways for it. I built a sonification system in Max. Very simple. It was a pitch-based one. I know I always say, you shouldn't use pitch-based sonifications if you can avoid it because they're horrible. But it was just a quick and dirty way to do it. Yeah. And it was simply the frequency of an oscillator was modulated by the value of the AFM data. And she quite liked that. And then I thought, why don't we try an audification? Let's get really direct, because the sonification is one step removed. It's a metaphor. It's a mapping.
Yeah.
The audification is the least mapped way of doing it, if you might put it that way.
In terms of the computer, it's almost the easiest, right?
Well, exactly. So I thought, what's the easiest way to do this? Write a Python script.
All right.
I've got all the data in an Excel spreadsheet. That's the format the data came out. So I just scaled all the data into 16-bit samples,
right,
and then wrote those to a WAV file and then played it back. It couldn't have been more simple, but she was really thrilled with that because she said it sounded like what she hoped it would sound like. When she had been trying to imagine what the movement of these microbes might be in this slide with a little water drop, that's kind of, it fit her expectations of what it should sound like. And for sonification or auditory display to be successful, I think you need that conceptual link between the sound you're hearing and the thing that it's representing.
Yeah, I really do. We're starting to arrive at that same kind of conclusion with this kind of project. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just, Bennett was saying, if you're going to have a sonification of honeybee population decline over the past 50 years or something, would it make sense somehow for the sound we're using to be some kind of buzzy bee sound? Now, it sounds a bit trite, but it creates a conceptual link between the sound and the data you're representing, rather than having the violins represent overall bee population and the oboes represent population density by state or something. There's just no kind of cognitive link there between the sounds and the data. So it might be harder to read.
And so then you need a legend in order to listen to the sonification and to decipher, the tide level is the trumpets and the blah, blah, blah is the blah, and
Well, that was exactly Bennett's criticism, although I think, to be fair, any sonification is going to need a legend.
Possibly. Well, again, if
just as visualizations do, charts have legends, and we need to understand.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, why can they have legends and we don't get them? But treating the data as the data model as an abstract reality that's being created by the information itself kind of opens up an ability to possibly transcend that. That's one of our fingers crossed approaches with our current work.
Yeah, I think that's one of the attractions of Thomas Hermann's model-based sonification.
Yeah, right.
Because it allows you to tap the data.
Yeah, it does.
In a sort of auscultatory sense, where we've got this data and then we can hit it and listen to the sound it makes. In the same way that a railway engineer would, in the old days, would tap the wheels of the engine to check that everything was sound and the train was safe.
Right, yeah, mechanic with his ear on a screwdriver to hear the inside of the engine and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, Paul, you know what? We have to do a second one of these.
Okay.
Because, just for me, as evidenced by my earlier paper and yours even earlier, this is a rich area of this area of research that really has been untapped and, more importantly, untested.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, and I've got some ideas about how we might start testing it now. So maybe we should hook up on that.
Oh, yeah, we should certainly do that. I mean, I have an anechoic chamber right across from my office for doing this kind of user testing. We have a strong link with the brain and neuroscience department, and so we're starting to head in that way. We haven't really done any real tests, and I can't find any real tangible. I mean, I'm sure it's out there, just like your paper was out there, and I didn't spot it, But we're trying to keep these in a half-hour sort of time frame.
Sure.
For I
We're
should say
that,
this is for the Sound and Data channel, and Paul Vickers. We didn't even get to the fantastic comedy bit that I saw.
It's on YouTube.
Well, it's on YouTube. So I'll put the link in the little bio thing that we'll have at the end, and we'll just say this is part one of a maybe multi-part discussion that we can have. Okay.
Sound and data.